mean, if you have a genre that you're interested in, go to a bookstore. You don't have to buy the book. Just go to the genre you're interested. Go back, look at the acknowledgments, jot down agents' names.
That was special author guest Richard Rooker sharing his advice on querying an agent. Stay tuned to hear more about Richard's journey as an author on Pages and Voices. I'm your host, Meg Bell. We'll be back after the intro. Welcome to Pages and Voices, the local author podcast, sponsored by the Allen County Public Library. This podcast is dedicated to featuring the works of talented authors within our community. Today's guest author is Richard Rooker, co-author of Buses Are A-Comin, Memoir of a Freedom Rider. Richard is an English and history educator, writing coach, and longtime friend of Charles Person, the co-author and subject of Buses Are A-Comin. Richard, who is a former board member of the Indiana Historical Society, grew up near Niagara Falls, New York, and moved to Indiana for college at Purdue University and graduate school at Indiana University. He met his wife Nancy during his 30-year career in education in Warsaw, Indiana. He has one adult son, Zach, and long-distance bike riding is his passion. Richard, welcome to Pages and Voices. It's a pleasure to have you join us today.
Oh, thank you. This is a pleasure to be here.
Great. So I'm going to have you share a brief reading from the book, but before I do, I'm going to tell our listeners about it. And this text actually comes from the flap of the book cover, a first-hand exploration of the cost of boarding the bus of change to move America forward, written by one of the civil rights movement's pioneers. At 18, Charles Person was the youngest of the original Freedom Riders, key figures in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement who left Washington, D.C. by bus in 1961, headed for New Orleans. This purposeful mix of black and white, male and female activists, including future Congressman John Lewis, Congress of Racial Equality Director James Farmer, Reverend Benjamin Elton Cox, journalist and pacifist James Peck, and Corps Field Secretary Genevieve Hughes set out to discover whether America would abide by a Supreme Court decision that ruled segregation unconstitutional in bus depots, waiting areas, restaurants, and restrooms nationwide. 2 buses proceeded through Virginia, North and South Carolina, to Georgia, where they were greeted by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and finally to Alabama. There, the Freedom Riders found their answer: no. Southern states would continue to disregard federal law and use violence to enforce racial segregation. One bus was burned to a shell, its riders narrowly escaping. The second, which Charles rode, was set upon by a mob that beat several riders nearly to death. Buses Are A-Comin provides a front-row view of the struggle to belong in America, as Charles Person accompanies his colleagues off the bus into the station, into the mob, and into history to help defeat segregation's violent grip on African American lives. It is also a challenge from a teenager of a previous era to the young people of today: become agents of transformation, stand firm, create a more just and moral country where students have a voice, youth can make a difference, and everyone belongs. Okay, Richard, you're up.
Thank you. Prologue. A Mother's Arms. The arms of mothers are made of tenderness. In them, children sleep profoundly. Victor Hugo. "Let's burn them alive! Let's burn them alive!" the voice said. Strong arms held the door of a burning bus closed from the outside. Angry men shouted vile words to the black and the white passengers sitting side by side in the bus, the Greyhound bus, traveling from Washington, D.C. to the Deep South through the Bible Belt. The passengers heard the hatred, saw the enmity, felt the venom. Panic mixed with resignation. Panic. No escape apparent. If escape were possible, the route out would lead to men bent on murder. Resignation. So this is how life ends, with last breaths being smoke, not air. If we got off that bus, remembered my friend Hank Thomas, there was no doubt in my mind we would have been killed. I decided that the best way to die was by taking a big gulp of poisonous smoke. I thought that would put me to sleep, and that's the way I was going to die. It was 2 p.m., Sunday, May 14, 1961, in Anniston, Alabama. 2 hours later, 60 miles to the west in Birmingham, Alabama, dozens of angry arms and fists and knuckles surrounded and beat a man. In his infancy, that man had slept profoundly in the tenderness of his mother's arms, his black mother's arms. It was now white arms of power and violence attacking him. Hadn't those men, too, slept profoundly in their mother's tender arms? Years earlier, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety had proclaimed, "Damn the law. Down here, we don't give a damn about the law. Down here, we make our own law." He had assured those bent on hate and violence they could have 15 uninterrupted minutes this day to do whatever they wanted to the unwanted black bus riders and their white companions before he and his police force would intervene. Had not the Commissioner of Public Safety also known the tender arms of his mother?
Thank you for sharing. It's imperative now I mention Charles. At the time of the book's release, in 2021, Charles was one of the 2 living Freedom Riders who remained with the original ride from its start in Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. This historic event helped to defeat Jim Crow laws in the United States. Person lived in Atlanta and was a sought-after public speaker. Unfortunately, Charles passed away on January 8th, 2025, at the age of 82 years old, so he can't be with us today. I would have loved to have talked with him about this. This book is absolutely incredible.
Thank you. I wish he could have been here.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it was like to experience these things firsthand. Even just reading it, it was giving me anxiety. So I imagine him writing it. Was it, if it was difficult for him to relive some of that?
Well, yes, it was. I want to say yes, it is, but it's past tense now.
Yeah.
Yes, it was difficult for him to relive these moments. I can't speak to what it was like for him to write those parts because I wasn't present with him as he was writing them. But I can say this, at speaking engagements, he would often stop, pause, have to collect himself, particularly when thinking about his fellow riders, all they went through and the suffering they endured to bring about change in the country. So it was painful for him.
Yeah, there's several good videos of him online that listeners can access and watch of him talking about this experience. There's a great one out there by Ancestry that if listeners want to see Charles talk directly about it, they can watch. But the parts in the book where he kept talking about the 2, Walter Bergman, an older white gentleman that was on the ride with his wife Frances, and then I believe the other guy's name was
Jim Peck.
Yeah, Jim Peck. He was a millionaire who just couldn't figure out why any of this stuff was happening, and he felt like it was really important for him to seek justice for black people in the South. But they both got beat up badly on these rides. Like those white guys that attacked that bus, they practically killed those 2 men. Within
inches of their life. Charles was in awe right up to the end of his life of what the white riders did on behalf of black citizens in this country. Jim Peck, for example, was 47 years old, as you said, a millionaire, and Charles had great difficulty wrapping his mind around the fact that someone who was a millionaire would risk his life on behalf of people who didn't have the same rights he had. And then Walter Bergman was the oldest rider at 61, and he was bludgeoned on the bus that Charles was on, practically killed. The only reason he wasn't killed was his wife begged for them not to kill him. And then when they made it to the Birmingham bus station, he literally crawled, a 61-year-old man already beaten terribly, crawled on his hands and knees to protect Charles and to come to Charles's aid. That was astonishing to Charles, and he had such great respect for them right up until the day he died.
I can imagine he did. It's incredible. And Walter suffered a life-altering stroke sometime after, not long after the bus rides ended.
Not long after at all. A few weeks after, he suffered a debilitating stroke that put him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, and doctors attributed it to the trauma he had experienced on the ride.
Sure. So, how did you meet Charles?
About 20 years ago, my, at the time, 7th, 8th grade son, Zach, was making a documentary on the Freedom Rides, nothing to do with school.
Uh-huh.
And
He's just doing this on his own time?
we had set up from the time he was very young, because I was an older dad when we gave birth to Zach.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't sure I could do the physical things that a dad might do with his son. So, and I love history. So I told him, we're going to study one thing in history every year as deeply as we can go at an age-appropriate level for you.
Good for you.
And then you're going to make a documentary out of it, because I knew how to make documentaries. I could teach him that on the computer.
Uh-huh.
And so from a very young age, kindergarten, first grade, I taught him how to do those types of things. And then the one condition I put on him was that you can pick the topic, but in 8th grade, you have to do something on race, because race, in my mind, is the great unsolved difficulty in our country since before we were a country. And so he picked the Freedom Rides that year and told me he wanted to do his documentary in a different way than he had done any others. He said, "Dad, I want to tell it from the perspective of the people in the story. I want them to be the narrators of the story." And I told him to do that, he would have to get interviews with Freedom Riders, Kennedy administration people, and Ku Klux Klansmen of that era if he could get them to say yes. That was very motivating to him. The next week I was coming home from work, and every day he was hanging up the phone saying, "Dad, we're going here. Dad, we're going there. Dad, we're going to Atlanta." Who's in Atlanta? Charles Person and Hank Thomas. So down we went to Atlanta, and Charles and his wife Joetta unbelievably invited us right into their house. That created opportunity for us to start a friendship that lasted till the end of his life, every year growing deeper. And by the end of his life, I'm confident both of us felt we were among each other's best friends.
That's incredible. I love that story. I can tell you in the 8th grade, I wasn't doing anything nearly that meaningful. I think I was still riding my bike a lot.
So was Zach. But he loved the process that we went through, and it was a wonderful growth experience for both of us. And it really changed all of our lives in our family.
It sounds like it. So you got to know Charles this way. Did he get yeses from KKK members to talk?
Yes, well, that's something that I would do over again if I had it to do over again. We were down in Anniston, and we sought out at the public library if there would be anybody formerly in the KKK that would speak to Zach, and they gave us the name of a person in the police force back then who was also a member of the KKK, and Zach called him on the phone. I always had Zach go in and do his own interviews. I didn't go in with him. And so here I am, the father of a 14-year-old, prepared to send him into the house of a at least former Ku Klux Klansman staying out in the car. To me, that's a bit crazy now, but at the time, it made sense to me for some reason. Anyway. Sure. That person had a very short conversation with Zach. Zach asked him, "Would you do an interview?" And he said, "I'm trying to forget that part of my life." Click. So no interviews with Ku Klux Klansmen.
Okay. Got it. So why do you think Charles was able to board a dangerous bus? Why was he able to turn his principle into action?
I think there were multiple reasons for that. First of all, by the time he was 18, he had experienced discrimination and segregation multiple times in multiple ways in Atlanta. He had seen his mother and father
Yes.
treated horribly, and he had seen his dad have fear. So that bothered him a lot. His grandfather, more than metaphorically, got in his face one day and said, "Do something, Charles," about the complaints Charles had about the system. And then the final thing I would say is that when he went to Morehouse, he saw the courage and determination of the upperclassmen in their effort to desegregate Atlanta. He wanted to be part of that. I think all of those things screwed up his courage and his determination to participate in the movement.
Yeah, because he ended up not finishing college, his freshman year of college, to do this. And that was kind of a point for him. He was like, do I leave school early? Do I not finish school? Because he was a very bright young man, really into science, but he decided that this was the path he needed to take. And he actually kind of fibbed to his dad to get him to sign the paperwork because he felt like it was so important to do.
Yes, he had been accepted to MIT for his science desires. He couldn't afford to go there. And then after he turned down MIT, surprisingly, Charles did not go back for his sophomore year at Morehouse. He wanted to, he intended to, he wanted to throw himself completely into the movement. His mother begged him and told him to go a different direction. She felt he would be safer in the military than he would be in the civil rights movement in the United States. The 20 years he served in the U.S. Marines put him in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis on the ground, and he was one of the first Marines to land in Vietnam in 1965. It's remarkable to me that his mother felt he would be safer in what would turn out to be the Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam than he would be in the United States Civil Rights Movement.
Absolutely. Charles had some stories, obviously. I mean, he lived such a life. The Civil Rights Movement, the Marines, Vietnam. It's incredible to me. So what did he did that for a profession. He did that for 20 years, the Marines. But what did he do after the Marines?
The Marines trained him in electronics, engineering, those types of skills. After he left the Marines in 1982, he served the Atlanta School Corporation for the rest of his career in those areas as a technician and an expert in those fields.
Okay. From your perspective, do you think Charles was satisfied at the end of his life with his accomplishments, or did he feel there was more to be done?
The answer to that would be yes and yes. Let's take the first one. Was he satisfied with his role in the movement? Charles took enormous pride in the role he played, but not just the role he played, all of his colleagues in the movement, the roles they played in changing America to bring more dignity, more equality to our country and to break the bonds of segregation. He was enormously proud of that, as well he should have been. At the end of his life, the satisfaction Charles took was in the need for additional change. For example, in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, he got on the phone that night with a friend of his named Pete Conroy in Anniston, Alabama, and said, "Do you see what's happening here, the way they're protesting? This is not going to go well. We need to do something about that." And he and Pete set up the Freedom Ride Academy in Anniston, Alabama, at the age of 78 for Charles, to address protest and the way to do it successfully, and then with police so that they are able to tamp down the possible violence that might occur. That was very important to Charles at the end of his life. He felt there was so much more to do, and he was working with Pete to do that through the Freedom Ride Academy.
And the Freedom Ride Academy is something that's still going today?
The Freedom Ride Academy still stands today. It teaches principles of Kingian nonviolent protest. An example of that would be to have a clear goal in mind of what you're protesting for. Make it a simple but achievable goal. So rather than trying to wipe out all forms of wrong, pick one particular thing. So for Charles, in his era, it would have been desegregate interstate transportation. A second principle, for example, would be do not do any protest after dark. Keep your protest to daylight hours because nothing good is going to happen after dark, and whatever bad happens is going to be blamed on the protesters. So those would be two examples of what the Freedom Ride Academy teaches.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. So when did you and Charles decide to co-author Buses Are Comin'? Whose idea was it?
The idea to try to publish a book was my idea. About 10 years after Charles and I met, my career in education was coming to an end. It was 2016. I asked him if he had ever thought of writing a memoir. He said yes, but he was no writer. I told him I had always wanted to try to write a book, but I'd been busy for 35 years. How about we give it a go? And so we did, and it worked out wonderfully well.
Okay, so you had never co-authored a book before this? This was your first go at that?
This was my first effort to author a book.
Okay, very good. It's a great book. I love it. So how did you and Charles collaborate successfully to make this happen? You're based out of Warsaw, Indiana. He was in Atlanta, Georgia.
We approached it a couple of different ways. First, starting in the fall of 2016, I held weekly FaceTime meetings that I recorded with Charles. So I have an incredible catalog
that's
of
wonderful.
Taped interviews with Charles. So that's where much of the material came from. A second thing I did was I created a chart with two columns in it. The first column was an emotion: mad, sad, glad, ow, wow, fear, exhilaration, that sort of thing, some sort of emotion. The second column would be a story from his life that in one sentence he would express, this made me feel ow. After that, I asked him to circle the stories he wanted to tell in the book, and I circled the ones I wanted him to tell in the book. From there, that helped us develop themes, and also from there, I gave him writing assignments every week. He would write on one of the stories. Inevitably, it would not have enough in it, and our next conversation would be to fill that information out.
Okay.
How does your dad look? What are his emotions? That sort of thing. Go deeper.
Okay. So how long did it take to write the book?
It took 3 years to write Buses and 1.5 years to bring it to publication. We started in the fall of 2016, ended in the fall of 2019, which gave us just enough time to secure a publisher that could bring it to publication within 1.5 years, which would be when the Freedom Ride anniversary would be coming up.
Okay. So I think we touched on this a little bit already, but I want to make sure I ask the question. Were there any parts that were particularly hard for Charles to write about?
It was difficult for Charles to write about the physical violence committed against nonviolent people. He had a hard time wrapping his mind around why people would commit violence against people who were not being violent toward them, and then the level of violence and the damage that the perpetrators of the violence committed against the Freedom Riders were difficult for him to write about and difficult for him to talk about.
So just to clarify something, because it did cause me a little confusion then when I was reading the book, I'm pretty sure it answered my question for me. The bus that Charles was not the bus that Charles was on. It was the other bus, the one that got burnt. Was that the one where the men got in line and they told the white riders who were trying to board that bus, don't get on this bus, we're going to get on this bus, because they trapped those people in that bus and then caught it on fire. So I was confused why they would do that to people who are just trying to get from point A to point B, and they have nothing to do with the Freedom Rides.
There were two buses, a Greyhound bus and a Trailways bus. They both left Atlanta the same day, but about 2 hours apart. The Greyhound bus was first. It pulled into Anniston, the first city in Alabama. and a mob surrounded the bus, rocked the bus, beat on the bus. They were trapped inside. The bus driver was determined to get out of there. He did. They had stabbed the tires 5 miles out of town. The bus could not go on any farther, but the mob had followed the Greyhound bus. They surrounded the bus, threw an incendiary device inside the bus, and held the door of the bus closed to burn the riders alive inside. There were no hoodlums inside that bus. Charles's bus was 2 hours behind. It was the Trailways. And in Anniston, that's where the line formed. That's people got on the bus. The hoodlums got on the bus and bludgeoned the riders who were on the bus. So the mob in Charles's situation was inside the bus. For the Greyhound bus, the mob was outside the bus holding the doors closed as they burned it.
How did they know they weren't just attacking innocent people? Like, everybody's innocent in the bus. Nobody deserved to be attacked. Let me make that clear. But, like, how do they know that? Did they let riders off that bus, or they just didn't care? Whoever was in the bus, they were getting trapped in the bus and they were catching it on fire.
That's the case. They did not care who was in the bus.
Okay, because it had the Freedom Riders on the bus, and they're like, sorry, you just picked the wrong bus.
You picked the wrong bus to get on today. We're going to do these people in.
I haven't.
Essentially, Meg, they were saying, we're going to teach you the last lesson of your life.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what stuck with Charles the most after everything that happened during the Civil Rights Movement?
What stuck with Charles the most was the damage that was done to his fellow riders and to him, and the way they were able to stand up to it and persevere through it, and the changes they made. That, I think, stuck with him the most. And the other thing, as we've already talked about, was the courage and determination of the white riders to come to the aid of the black riders, which was a puzzlement to him. Certainly deeply appreciated it. He had a difficult time understanding why people who had everything they could possibly want in life would surrender that so that someone like him could have what they had.
Mm-hmm. Did these people remain lifelong friends for him?
The Freedom Riders are a tight community. Overall, there were 436 by the end of the year. The 13 original were stopped in Anniston and Birmingham. Immediately, a group of replacement riders stepped in to carry on that. They were bludgeoned and beaten. Replacement riders followed them. They were imprisoned in Parchman Prison in Mississippi. And then they were done. Then they were done. There wasn't anybody left. And so in prison, they sang, "Buses are a-comin', oh yeah. Buses are a-comin', oh yeah. Buses are a-comin', buses are a-comin', buses are a-comin', oh yeah." They had no idea if any buses were coming. No idea whatsoever. They sang it to screw up their own courage and also as a threat.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What was the number one thing you and Charles hoped to accomplish with the book?
What Charles hoped to accomplish was the awareness of the cost of the ticket for everyone participating on the ride. An example of that would be Hoosier David Myers, who was a Freedom Rider. He, when he finished the Freedom Ride, could not find a job in the state of Indiana. No one would hire him because he had been a Freedom Rider. There's a Fort Wayne rider born in Fort Wayne named David Fankhauser, and he too faced some discrimination in his life afterwards. So that was the number one thing I think Charles hoped to accomplish, was bringing awareness of the cost of the ticket. For me, it was to tell the story of courage. Courage is really important to me. I wonder if I have it, what it would look like, how it would manifest itself if I did have it. And the Freedom Riders are a perfect example of courage. Stephen Ambrose wrote a book on Lewis and Clark called Undaunted Courage. I think of the Freedom Riders as courage undaunted.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So you've taught English and you are a writing coach, but were there any resources you found valuable while co-authoring the book?
There were many resources, Meg. First of all, other books written on the Freedom Riders. The best of those is by Raymond Arsenault. That was one source. Another was traveling to those sites and experiencing those. Another was researching in libraries like the Atlanta University Center, which is the library for the historically black colleges of Atlanta. So those were excellent sources of information for me. And then I was able to access at those places primary sources, newspaper articles, magazine articles from the era, and then also conversations with people who were involved in the event, like Lonnie King, who was huge in the Atlanta student movement. I called him to get an interview with him. His health was declining. He told me a little bit, but he led me to some sources online of interviews that I was able to access of him in his voice telling his part of the story. Lonnie and Charles were incredibly good friends, and Charles could tell Lonnie's story, but not as well as Lonnie could tell his own story. So Lonnie led me to interviews online when he was unable to, because of his health, give me an interview, and those were valuable resources to me.
Mm-hmm. As you work at the craft of writing, what is a joy and a hardship you find in the process?
Well, I'll take the hardship first. The hardship for me is keeping my seat in the seat. So to accomplish writing a book like this, you have to put your seat in a seat and stay there. And overall, Meg, I consider myself a letter writer. I write hundreds of long letters a year to various people. I don't have any difficulty doing that, but doing that to sit down and write a book was a challenge to me. As for the joy, I would say the joy is composing a wonderful sentence. When I was a teacher, I would encourage students to be proud of a particular sentence they wrote in such a way that they would say, wow, I wrote that. Or if they read something and they really enjoyed it, say, wow, I wish I had written that, and then examine the sentence to see what that author did and if they could emulate it. And so there were some examples in the book of sentences I really enjoyed. There was an episode in the book where during the Atlanta student movement, Charles and some friends were desegregating a counter. The manager comes out with a cleaver in his hand and tells one of Charles's friends, take that menu out of your hand or I'll take it out for you, threatening him with the cleaver. And to increase the tension of that, eventually the manager goes off, and I wrote, the meat cleaver stormed off with the manager's hand attached to it. I really like that sentence.
That is a good sentence. It stuck out to me, too, when I read the book. So I agree. So did you guys have to query a book agent to get this published?
We did that different ways. So first of all, I told Charles I would take control and be in charge of the publishing end. He would be in charge of interviews, that sort of thing. So when it came to seeking a publisher, yes, we did have to query agents. The first way I did that was to attend 3 different agent pitch conferences, which I would really encourage aspiring writers to do. That was very helpful, one in Madison, Wisconsin, one in Indiana, and one in New York City. They were very helpful in the techniques. We didn't have a single clue what we were doing, and those guided us along the way. The second thing I did was query a particular agent whom I really wanted to represent the book, and he ended up representing the book. I did that, and this might be helpful to aspiring writers. I queried that agent by inserting in the first paragraph how that particular agent had changed my life in a way. So I told a story in the query letter, just a very brief 1-paragraph story of how that agent had impacted my life so strongly. And then the second paragraph was, I write to you today to tell you about a book. And that was a very successful technique to use. I might encourage your writers to try to make a personal connection with an agent so they're instantly interested in who's writing to them.
Okay. So the book ended up being published by St. Martin's Publishing Group, which is part of Macmillan out of New York City. Was that an easy process?
Working with St. Martin's, I would not say was an easy process. I would say it was a wonderful process.
Oh, great.
The president of St. Martin's, George Whitty, took us under his wing, so that was spectacular that the president himself would guide us through this process. He put together a wonderful team when it comes to copy editing and marketing and distribution, all the different things that have to go into a successful book. So nothing but kudos for St. Martin's. They were incredible.
So did you query your agent or connect through the conferences you attended?
We queried one agent. His name was Greg Johnson with WordServe Literary out of Colorado. We did that because a book he represented was one I greatly admired and I wanted to model buses after. So I wrote him a query letter, and I'd like to read that first paragraph from that letter. Dear Greg, the 2016 New York Times best-selling memoir, All the Gallant Men by Don Stratton and Ken Geyer, that you represented, had a profound impact on the lives of 4 students and me. It introduced us to the stories of Don Stratton and Joe George. The students created an award-winning history project based on your book. That project, in turn, led the Stratton and George families to invite us to be 5 of the 50 people present on the USS Arizona during the Joe George Medal Ceremony on December 7, 2017. Thank you for bringing Don Stratton's story to us and so many others. Next paragraph. Today I write to offer you an 85,000-word memoir, Buses Are A-Comin. I wanted to share that with the audience because I think that's a really effective way to connect with a possible agent, and that is to start your query letter with a personal story, anecdote. It could be what a book meant to you that agent brought to publication. You can find the agent in the acknowledgments of the book. So that's how we found our agent, was in the acknowledgment section of All the Gallant Men, and I wanted to tell the agent the story of how he had impacted our lives, and then go into what I was asking of him that day.
Okay, that's great advice. Thank you. So did the publishing house design this cover? Did Charles have a say in that with the pictures they used?
It did, and I'm holding it up, which won't do our audience any good, but we had no control or very little control over the cover of the book. They designed it and they showed it to us for our approval. That was it. And the only change we made, and it was a very important change for Charles, was that on the front cover there's a picture of young Charles Person next to White Rider Jim Peck. And the picture originally had all of Charles and just half of Jim Peck. And Charles was very insistent that it have all of Jim Peck's face on it. That's the only input we had, and they granted that request.
Okay. Was there any part of the publishing process that you found painful?
There was no part of the process I found painful. There were anxieties that it created. I have anxiety issues and insecurity issues, and deadlines don't help those. So there were some hard deadlines. One, for example, I thought we'd have 45 days to do. They told us 15 days. And so at that point, I was getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and going to bed at 10 o'clock at night to meet that hard deadline. So that wasn't painful. It was a positive pressure on my life to get the work done. But there were some funny parts, too. My wife and I do a happy dance when we send something off to a publisher, and we did that one time expecting to hear back in a month or so, and we no sooner set it off than ping, a response came back, which I thought was going to be I'm out of the office response. And it was, Richard, I've been waiting to hear from you. So that was mind-blowing. We did a little happy dance in my office. And then if aspiring writers want to know a line that will bring the house down at a writers' conference, it's this. The conference inevitably will have agents and publishers on a stage, and everyone in the conference attending it will be in the audience, maybe 30, maybe 150, and they'll open it for Q&A. I raised my hand at the first writing conference I went to and asked this question: what happens if we get more than one agent interested in our book? The whole room erupted in laughter. The agents and publishers erupted in laughter. Everyone in the
Like
room.
that can't possibly happen.
That's not going to happen.
Right.
So it was such a funny line, which stunned me, that when I went to the next conference, I asked it on purpose just to see if it would have the same effect. Same effect.
Uh-huh.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll have to remember that. So do you have any plans to write any more books in the future?
I'm not sure on that. My goal in writing Buses, after writing Buses, was to follow it up with a sequel called Buses Are a Comin', Ride On, the story that I would collaborate with a freedom rider on, a replacement rider who picked up the baton after the first riders were stopped, and tell that story. So I reached out to some. One of them, Charles's best friend in life, died, unfortunately, so that stopped that effort. A second replacement freedom rider I wanted to contact was David Dennis Sr. I asked Charles if he would give me his contact information. Charles said he would, but he was already writing a book with his journalist son, David Dennis Jr., whom people listening to this might recognize if you are into sports and watch a sports show called Around the Horn. He's a regular guest on that show. So I wanted to do a book with David Dennis Sr., but I'm so glad that he and his son collaborated together. It tells the same story that I imagined telling with David Dennis, but it has a father-son component to it that's just lights out terrific. And then others simply turned me down. So no other books in the pipeline at this time.
Okay. So I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit and just ask some get-to-know-you questions. What kind of books do you enjoy reading?
I enjoy reading books on Black history, whether it's Black history or biography or autobiography or poetry. I really enjoy books in that genre because I admire the Black struggle in our country. So writers I might enjoy, deceased writers I might enjoy would include Frederick Douglass, Dr. King, John Lewis, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin. Living writers in that area would include Isabel Wilkerson or Michelle Alexander, Eddie Glaude Jr.
Okay. So I think you talked about this earlier, but did you travel as research when writing this book?
I did. I traveled extensively. Of course, I made multiple trips down to Atlanta to read chapters with Charles and his wife, Joetta, and my wife, Nancy. So that was travel we did. But I also traveled to Atlanta to get the feel of places important in the story. So Bradley Street, for example, I wanted, even though it's decades later, I wanted to get the feel of it. The feel of a place, even so far removed from the time, is so important to me. I feel things strongly that way. And so I went to Birmingham to be at Bethel Baptist Church, where the Freedom Riders sought refuge. I went to Anniston, of course, to see the places where the violence took place in Anniston and 5 miles outside of Anniston. Charles and I traveled to Washington, D.C. To do some research there, so quite a bit of travel. Okay.
Did you and Charles celebrate when you finished the book?
We celebrated separately. Charles and his family celebrated in Atlanta, and then I wasn't expecting any celebration, and my friends threw an enormous celebration that took me completely by surprise. They had told me for weeks that a picnic was going to take place, and I was getting ready to go to a picnic. We started walking up to this huge tent with all these people in it. My friend and I were walking up to the tent, and there was a standing ovation. I looked at him and I said, "Did you do something recently?" So that was wonderful. But outside of celebration, the most poignant moment that took place was in Anniston during a book signing. We were outside, and Charles was signing books, and a woman in line said to him, "I'm here not only to have you sign the book, I'm here to apologize. My father is the person in this picture with the club in his hand beating you. And I come to apologize for him." As soon as she said that, complete silence. People pulled out phones to record this moment. And she turned to all of us and said, "I'd like you to put your phones away. My father is deceased, but my mother is still living. And if she finds out I'm apologizing to Charles, it will not go well for our family." And so everyone put their phones away. But that was amazing. No one in 60 years had apologized to Charles.
I got chills. That's powerful. If Busted Are Comin were made into a movie, who would you like to play Charles?
That's a difficult question to answer because Charles was 18, and I'm not too up on 18-year-old black actors or 18-year-old actors at all. But I would say, whether you like this movie or not, in Equalizer 2, there's an actor named Ashton Sanders. He's probably 30-ish now. If he could pull off being 18, I think he played that role in Equalizer 2 remarkably well, of a young black man trying to find his place and the travails he faces to find his place in the world and to grow into who he's going to be. So I was not familiar with him, but I really appreciated his performance.
I'll have to check it out. So finally, how can interested parties reach you, Richard?
I'm a pretty private person, so I don't have a website. And I'm not on social media. The best way to contact me would be through my author email, richard.rooker.author@gmail.com.
Okay, thank you. So, Richard, thank you for joining us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Meg. I've appreciated this, too. If I could add this at the end, I have a sign on a mirror in our bathroom where I brush my teeth at night, and the sign says, "Who enriched your life today?" And tonight it's going to be you.
Well, thank you. That's a very kind thing to say.
I've really appreciated this and enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to those who listened in. Stay tuned for more authors on Pages and Voices. I'm your host, Meg Bell. Until next time. Thank you for joining us on Pages and Voices, a source for local authors and their stories. From the studios of Access Fort Wayne at the Allen County Public Library in downtown Fort Wayne, Indiana, I'm your host, Meg Bell. A special thank you to Kay Gregg for her work engineering and editing this episode. We've explored fascinating stories and insightful discussions today, but our journey doesn't end here. Find more episodes of Pages and Voices wherever you listen to podcasts. If you enjoyed this podcast, please show your support by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with your friends and family. Stay tuned for more inspiring conversations with the area's authors and their insights into the written word. Until next time, keep turning the pages, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon.